pretty boring on my end. All right, I think that noise means we are recording. So I'm about to, let's see here. Sent a window.
Did I take chapter 1 notes? I think I was in class. Is what I.
Unfortunately, I can't tell you. Okay, so you should see my PowerPoint right now.
Yeah.
But let me try something different because you don't want to see that version of it. All right. Do you see like the actual PowerPoint, or do you see like my view where it would look like I'm giving the lecture?
I think I see that actual PowerPoint.
Okay, good. There we go. All right, then. Yeah, so as it says, this is chapter 1. It's basically the preview for what the rest of the semester is about, and you'll see what I mean as we go through it. Every chapter starts off where it says why biology matters, and it has these little pictures. And usually it's pretty fun, and I like to play the guessing game with the students, but we're a little bit behind. Plus, we're living in the middle of a pandemic, so usually I spend a lot of time trying to discuss with the students and why biology does matter to them, because you guys aren't biology majors. But if you don't get why biology matters and we're living in a pandemic, there's not much I can say. So we'll move forward with that. Same with this first slide. Like I said, I usually spend a little bit of time talking to the students and trying to make this course relevant to their education. And another thing I talk about a lot in the semester, and usually during this this first lecture, is the fact that a bachelor's degree is different than a like a trade degree, for example. And the difference, well, there's a lot of differences, but the main difference that I'm focused on right now is that when you're done getting your bachelor's degree, when you graduate, you should be more equipped to think for yourself. So I have a lot of friends who didn't go to college, a lot of people I served with, and they say, oh yeah, colleges are just there to brainwash people and indoctrinate them. And I see that as the opposite, because I'm hoping by the end of this, like I said, you will just be able to think for yourself. I'm not telling you what to think, I'm teaching you how to think. So at the end of this course, specifically, you're not going to be a biology expert. And a lot of the stuff you might actually forget after a few months, but you still have that basic foundation. So later in your life, or whenever in your life, when you come across an issue that has to deal with biology and you want to do your own research and think for yourself, you'll have this foundation, this basic biology. Even the stuff you forgot, you'll be amazed. It'll come back to you once you start looking into it. But so again, so far, I'm just going to move forward. This is just an introduction as to why biology is important. Now, this chapter itself is broken down into 3 major points. It's the scientific study of life is what we'll talk about first, then the properties of life, and then this third one has already been discussed and recorded, so you can find that on Google Classroom. But let's dive into it. I don't know, for those of you who are present, who I can't see anymore because I'm doing the presentation, I don't know how many of you were present for the first lecture, but does anybody know what the definition of biology is? No guesses? That's okay. A lot of times people guess they say it's the study of life. I was always taught that it's the study of life, and that's a correct statement. It's just not as correct as it could be. Because biology, as you need to know for the exam, is the scientific study of life. So it's not just the study of life, it's the scientific study of life. So that should bring up some questions in and of itself. If it's the scientific study of life, then what is a scientific study, right? What does science mean? And we're going to talk, if you're taking notes, there's no need to write these 3 things down because we're going to talk about them. But yeah, what is a scientific study? What is science? These are things we're going to discuss in this chapter. Then we're going to discuss then, because biology is the scientific study of life, then what is life? What does it mean to be alive? And we're going to study that in this chapter, or we're going to discuss that in this chapter. But then that's basically what this whole semester is about. So biology to me is really fascinating. Obviously, I teach it. I love biology. But I'm going to be completely honest with you right now. The stuff I'm teaching you, some of it might seem a little bit boring. I'm going to try to make it entertaining, but I'm teaching you the very basics. Like, this is what it means to be alive, is what we're going to learn. So that's one of the reasons I have independent work, for example. Like, I love sharks, like Shark Week, that kind of stuff. But I don't teach you anything about sharks in this class because it's not relevant to what it means to be alive. So that's what independent work's for. Find something that you're interested in and look into it. But anyway, we will talk about that, what it means to be alive in this chapter. And then finally, if I'm saying biology is the scientific study of life, and I'm really focusing on the scientific portion, then that begs the question, well, how else can you study life? And that's what we'll talk about first, really. Because your book mentions that there are other ways of studying life, and there are. And does anybody have any guesses, if you haven't seen this lecture before, what are some of the other ways you can study life other than a scientific way? And I'll give you some hints. What about this question? What is the meaning of life? That's not a scientific question, right? So what kind of question might that be?
Like
Philosophical.
Yeah, exactly. These are just some lists. This is a list from your book. Obviously, there's probably others, but these are big ones. Religion, right? Like I said, what does it mean to be alive? That's also a good philosophy question. When did life start? We have a scientific way of looking into that, but there's also religious ways, historic ways, philosophy, right? So you don't need to memorize this. This is nothing that's going to be on the exam or anything that you need to know for the rest of the semester. We're just trying to differentiate here. The point is, in biology, we have a scientific study of life. We're not saying that our way of understanding is better than any of these. We're saying that all of these, including our way of understanding life, is just a great broad education, right? You need to have that broad education. So ours is just one way of looking at things. It's not any better. It's just different. So nothing to know here. It's just a good introduction. Are there any questions about this slide?
Nope.
All right, moving on. So then that begs the question, if there are all these other different ways of studying life versus our way, then what is the difference? So that's what we'll talk about very briefly. And again, this is just a discussion to get us into biology. There's nothing that you need to know for the rest of the exam, and the rest of the semester, and nothing that you need to know for the exam. Except this, some of it. I'll let you know when there is something you need to know for the exam. Your book defines science as an approach to understanding the natural world based on inquiry, which is a really long-winded way of saying we're just trying to understand nature, right? By asking questions. So we look at nature, we ask questions, and we try to answer them. So yeah, technically this is the definition. If you were to look it up in different sources, you might get a slightly different answer. Just like if you look up any word in multiple dictionaries, you might get a slightly different answer. But this is the definition you should know. I probably won't ask you the definition of of science. I'm more interested that you understand how science works than understanding or memorizing the definition. So let's get into that, how it works. The book says that science is a search, right? Because again, we're trying to understand the natural world, right? So we're searching for information. We're searching for explanations. We're searching for answers to specific questions. There's no need to write any of this down either if you're taking notes. But I like that your book points this out, that this is what we're searching for with biology. But it's also worth noting that these things at this point have not differentiated biology from religion and history and philosophy and all that stuff, right? So if you're studying life in the lens of religion, you're still looking for information. If you're a philosopher, you're still looking for explanations. If you're a historian, you definitely want answers to specific questions, right? So far, we have not differentiated, but we are getting there. Are there any questions so far?
Is there a way you could make the screen more to the side? Because it's kind of cut off.
Cut off. Let me see. I wish I could see what you're seeing. So can you see can you see my laser pointer right now?
No.
Oh, thank you. All right. Let me, glad you said something. Let me try something else here. All right, so we're still recording.
Yeah, it's actually like that on mine too.
Okay, so now you shouldn't see anything but my blur, right? Because I just stopped sharing. Okay.
Yeah.
Previously, so you're saying you could see some of the slide, just not the whole slide. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Seems like the far right was cut off, you know?
Okay. Yeah, let me work on that here. Slideshow from current slide. I'm glad you said something. Let's try this again. Window. If this doesn't work, I have one other idea. So now you should be seeing the presenter view, which is not the ultimate goal. So 1 second. From current slide. Let's see. Now can you see the whole screen? It should just say an overview of the process of science at the top, and that's it. It should be blank other than that. Can you see that?
We don't see the text.
There's nothing there.
Wow. Okay. Let me try one more thing. This should work. Entire screen. Okay. Come on. And all right, at this point, you should be looking at my entire screen, right? So you probably see your own names and see my mouse moving around.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This should do us then. Here we go from current slide. How about now?
Looks good.
Oh, it's kind of like blank.
That's okay. But at the top, it says an overview of science.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Good. Now we're in action. I'm so glad you guys said something. So yeah, we've already covered this. We know what science is the search for. And like I said, so far we haven't differentiated biology from anything else, but here's where it gets a little bit different. Let's talk about what scientists do as opposed to, biology, or excuse me, like philosophers or religious people who study religion. Scientists seek natural causes. They focus on processes and structures that can be verifiably observed and measured. So, for example, if someone wanted to know, maybe there was an earthquake, and someone said, "Well, what was the cause of it?" Right? So, scientists can figure out; they can pinpoint where the earthquake came from. That's a natural cause. But somebody else who maybe studies the religion, most people wouldn't, but some people might say, "Well, according to my religious text, earthquakes are caused when one of the gods is angry at humans," right? So I'm not going to tell you that's wrong. I don't know. That's not my place. All I'm saying is scientists don't seek those kind of answers. We seek natural causes. The reason being because we have to study things that we can observe, right? Things we can see, things we can measure. So that's the big difference. Are there any questions about this slide? All right. Moving forward, if it'll let me. There we go. All right. So the next thing we're going to get into is talking about the scientific method or the scientific process. You've probably heard it before. And if you were to look it up in other sources, it's not going to be exactly the way I'm teaching it. I'm teaching it exactly out of your book. But the scientific method is just a basic guideline on how we do science. There's nothing set in stone. There's no Congress of scientists who decided, all right, this is exactly how the scientific method must go. It's just a general guideline. So for the sake of studying and for the sake of this semester, make sure you know the scientific method that I'm about to teach you. So here we go. The first step is something called exploration, aka observation. So you could put those, if you're taking notes, you could just write exploration/observation. In the context of understanding the steps of the scientific method, those are interchangeable. Those are the first steps, excuse me. That is the first step. So we're talking about exploration. This is a good example from your book. This is a famous scientist named Jane Goodall. She spent a lot of time exploring, right? So she spent time with chimpanzees. She took notes. She observed. She wasn't necessarily answering any specific questions, which is what science does, right? She was just basically, at least for the sake of this conversation, she was observing, she was exploring, she was taking data. So that's the first step. Now, I guess the difference between exploration and observation is sometimes observation is just a more natural thing. Like exploration, that's clearly like that's a scientist doing science, right? Observation could be an everyday life thing. And this is kind of a crude example, but I like to use it because hopefully people remember it because of its crudeness. But I'll say, for example, when my friends, well, prior to COVID, when my friends would come over to my house to hang out, maybe on a Friday night, we'd hang out on the back deck and have some drinks, and we'd stay up late. And my buddies would need to use the restroom, but they were too loud. So my wife would say, listen, you can't come inside anymore. You're waking up the kids. So my friends would pee in my yard in the same spot. Now, let's say that I look over there where my friends are always peeing and I notice the grass is really green. That would be an observation, right? I mean, I'm not formally doing the process of science, but I am still observing something. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Won't be a test question, but the idea here is that exploration/observation, that's the first step. But yeah, technically there is slightly a difference between exploration and observation. I'm not going to test you on that. I just want you to make sure you understand that there is a difference. So again, observation is the first step. So I'm going to use this crude example. I'm going to keep using that. If I observe that the grass is a lot nicer where my friends pee, then that's going to lead to the next step, which is question, right? So step 2, question, or questions, it doesn't matter. But yeah, so step 1, exploration/observation. Step 2, question. So I would think to myself, I wonder if urine is good for plants. That's the question. So what comes after a question? And forget biology for a second. If someone asks you a question, then what comes after that?
The answer.
Right, the answer. But in this case, we don't necessarily call it an answer because technically we don't know the answer yet, but we do have a proposed explanation or for the set of observations. So again, going back to the crude example, my hypothesis might be urine is good for plants, right? So again, I observe that the grass is greener. My question is urine good for plants? And my hypothesis is yes, urine is good for plants. So what you need to know for the exam, other than the hypothesis, is step 3. You need to know that the hypothesis is a proposed explanation for a set of observations. And really, if you're taking shorthand, I think the most important thing is proposed explanation. Hypothesis is a proposed explanation. Yes, it's for a set of observations, but to me, the most important thing is it's a proposed explanation. And again, if you were to look this up in another source, you might get a slightly different answer. Hypothesis, some sources might say it's a tentative answer. So it is an answer, but it's tentative. Like, right, here's the answer, but it's tentative because we haven't tested it yet. Which brings us to this little portion right here. A hypothesis has to be testable, and it has to be falsifiable. In a lot of ways, these go hand in hand. And going back to that example of earthquakes, if someone said the god of the ocean got angry at humans and made an earthquake, we can't test that. I mean, that would be a proposed explanation for the observation, and the observation would be you observed an earthquake, but we can't test that, right? And we can't falsify that. We can't test it because no one knows how to reach the god of the ocean, right? So if you believe in multiple gods, like, you can't just send an email and say, hey, did you do that? Therefore, we also can't falsify it, right? So we can show that, oh yeah, this earthquake came from this fault line under this ocean. But then still someone else could say, well, no, I still think it was my ocean god. We can't falsify that because, technically it could be. We don't know. We can't prove that, or we can't falsify it because it's not testable. So anyway, for the exam, what you need to focus on is that a hypothesis is a proposed explanation. So any questions on the hypothesis?
No.
All right.
Self-explanatory.
Okay, good. So it gets a little bit trickier on the next part. So a hypothesis leads to predictions. And a lot of people get these confused. And I tried to simplify it in this course by saying a prediction, and it's not written on here, but for the sake of this course, just to keep things simple, A prediction will always be an if-then statement. So let me give you an example. If we're going back to my buddies peeing in the yard, and my hypothesis is urine is good for plants. So I could write a prediction based on that hypothesis to test it. So I could say, if my friends stop peeing in that part of the yard, then the grass will not look as nice. See what I did there? So I have my hypothesis, and from that hypothesis, I wrote a prediction because that's a very specific way for me to test that hypothesis. My friends will stop peeing in that yard, in that part of the yard. And then another thing, and I really focus on this a lot too, in real science, you can't just test a hypothesis once and be done with it. You have to come up with different ways of testing it. Thus, you're going to have multiple predictions. So like I said, prediction 1 could be, if my friends stop peeing in the yard right there, then the grass will not be as green. Prediction 2, if my friends start peeing in a different part of the yard, then that grass will turn green. Prediction number 3, if I have 2 plants and I give one of them water and give one of them urine in a controlled experiment, then the one with urine will do better than the one with water. I could go on and on, but the point here is that a prediction is basically an if-then statement, and it's just a different way of testing your hypothesis. So if you guys don't have any questions, I will move forward, because again, a prediction is kind of verbalizes a way that you can test your hypothesis. So that obviously leads us to our next step, which is scientific tests. Your book gives this example, so I'm going to go through it pretty quickly because we've already been talking about the scientific process. I've been giving you my own examples, but I like to teach out of the textbook. That way, if you're following along, you get it. And also, if you're reading your textbook, as you should, then you'll understand what you're reading. But here's a remote control. So imagine you're sitting down on the couch. You click the little power button because you want to watch a show, and the TV doesn't turn on. That's an observation. So after the observation comes a question. So naturally, your question is going to be, what is wrong, right? So from that one question, you can have all kinds of hypotheses. The battery's dead. The remote is broke. The TV is broke. The TV is unplugged. The power is out, right? There's all these different kind of hypotheses. Your book sticks with this one. Hypothesis, the remote's batteries are dead. Now, in real life, think about this. You don't actually think, when you're going through this situation, you're not thinking about the scientific process. You're not saying, okay, I have my hypothesis. Next comes the prediction, then the experiment, right? You don't think about that, but you are doing it, even though you don't think you're doing it. So usually from hypothesis, you would, in this situation, you would probably jump straight to the experiment, right? If you thought the batteries remotes were dead, then you would put the batteries in it. But technically, since we're teaching you the proper scientific method, let's talk about the prediction. If I replace the batteries, then the remote will work. I should say then, but it doesn't. So you replace the batteries. If it works, yay. Well, let me come back. If it doesn't work, you're back to square one, right? Like, oh, that didn't work. I put new batteries in there. It didn't work. So now what do I do? Now you revise your hypothesis, and you might come up with something else. Again, like I said, maybe the batteries, or maybe the remote's broken. Maybe the TV's broken. All these different things. And you would keep doing that until you supported your hypothesis, until you chose a hypothesis that was correct. The only thing I don't like about this example is in real life, if you pop the new batteries in, which is what this is, you know, that's the experiment, and you hit the power button and the TV turns on and it supports your hypothesis, in real life, you're done, right? You're just going to watch whatever show you want to watch. But as I was saying earlier with the urine example, you're not done. You're just going to keep doing more predictions, testing more and more predictions, because the more predictions you can test, the better your supported your hypothesis is. So does anybody have any questions about this slide?
No.
All right. Pretty simple stuff. Here's yet another example of the relationship and differences between a hypothesis and a prediction. I'm not going to read it. This is not from your book. That's why I put it on there. It's just another example. You can read it if you want. Because it's an example and because it's not in your book, I'm not going to test you on it. It's just one more example. So that brings us to the last portion. As far as the exam is concerned, what I'm about to teach you is not important. as far as everyday life is concerned, it is important. So before we move forward, as far as the exam is concerned, what I just told you with these two bullet points is what you need to know for the scientific method, which is step 1, observation, step 2, question, step 3, hypothesis, step 4, prediction, step 5, experiment. So moving forward, this is the stuff that will not be on the exam, but stuff that is extremely valuable for your everyday life. A lot of people say that we're in the information age. I like to say that we are in the misinformation age. I don't know how many of you are on social media, but it's ridiculous and it drives me crazy. And this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about teaching at the collegiate level, because again, I want people to be able to think for themselves, and they seem to not be able to do it. And one of the ways that you can do that, one thing that will help, is knowing what kind of information is good information. So if you're looking at something, for example, that says masks are useless against COVID, or masks are hurtful when it comes to COVID, or masks are very effective when it comes to COVID, right? I've seen all of these claims. So if you're looking into it because you want to know what to do, then you need to look for things that have been peer reviewed. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So before something can get published in a scientific journal, right? Anybody can publish anything to the internet, but before something can get published in a scientific journal, that research has to be evaluated by qualified, impartial, and often anonymous experts that were not involved in the study, right? So obviously you want qualified individuals. For example, I work on plant genetics. My research was in plant genetics. So I'm probably not going to evaluate someone's research if they were doing animal behavior, right? That's not my portion of biology. I'm not going to evaluate someone's research if they're my best friend, right? Because I'm probably not going to be impartial. So on and so forth. I don't need to go through each of these things. You understand the point here. And the reason we do this is because it's intended to provide quality control. And this whole process is something we call peer review. And I haven't been around as long as some of the other professors in Hamblin Hall, but from what I've seen so far, what I can tell you is scientists love to prove each other wrong. So if something makes it through the peer review and gets published, usually it's pretty legit, because like I said, scientists love to prove other scientists wrong. They love to argue. So actually, a little side note here. So when you hear people say, talking about climate change and saying that, of course everyone's on board, all the scientists are on board with it because they don't want to buck the system, right? They don't want to cause any waves. And I would imagine that is not true because, again, scientists love to argue. They love to prove other people wrong. So anyway, this is what peer review is. This is why it's important. And we're actually going to talk about it a little bit more in this chapter. But are there any questions so far as what peer review is?
No.
Okay. This, if you're taking notes, you definitely don't need to take any notes here. This is just your textbook saying, hey, listen, this is why this is relevant, right? So instead of just saying, hey, we do all this science and we do these experiments and peeing on bushes and things like that, what your book is trying to say is we don't just do these for the pure sake of science or just for the fun of it, right? Many scientific research or experiments, they are focused on solving problems. So there's actually usually something that we're trying to figure out, something important that we're trying to figure out when we do science. The ultimate aim is usually to benefit society. And a lot of the research focuses on outcomes that highlights connections between biology, your own life, and society. So again, your book's just trying to sell you on biology because, again, this is chapter 1. So your book's trying to say, hey, this is why biology is important in your everyday life. I'm going to move forward. You'll hear me use these words a lot. I already have. I've said hypothesis a lot. We're going to also discuss theories. We're also going to discuss facts. And you need to understand how these 3 words are related and how they're different. So we're going to get into that, and then we'll actually be done with this video, because video 2 starts right here at controlled experiments. First of all, theory. This word is often misused. Like my son has had sleeping issues for the past couple of years, and we talk about it with our family a lot. And someone might say, well, my theory is, he shouldn't have so much screen time after 6 o'clock. And that, what they just said, was a hypothesis. That's not a theory. So the first thing I'm going to tell you before I tell you what the book says a theory is, first thing you need to know is a theory is not a hypothesis, and it's often used in place of the word hypothesis. That being said, a theory is a comprehensive, well-substantiated explanation that is broader in scope than a hypothesis. So for the exam, I would focus on the bold part there. A theory is broader in scope than a hypothesis. Because in a way, a theory is a lot like a hypothesis. Because remember, a hypothesis is an explanation, right? It's a proposed explanation. It's a tentative answer. It's the same thing with a theory. That is a theory explains something. Except in this case, a hypothesis is very specific. A theory, like it says right here, it's much broader in scope. It's a lot bigger. It explains a lot more. And on top of that, like we said here, it's comprehensive, meaning, so it's not, again, it's not so specific. Well substantiated, right? So I did one study on watermelon genome. That was just one study. And it did get peer reviewed, and I worked with other people. But again, that's just one study. That hasn't been well substantiated yet. There haven't been other people who have also done the study. So there's definitely some differences between a theory and a hypothesis. But the big one, as far as the exam is concerned, is that a theory, it's broader in scope. It's answering bigger questions. I've already kind of touched on this one a little bit. A theory is only widely accepted if supported by a large, varied, growing body of evidence. That kind of goes hand in hand with the well-substantiated part, right? So it's not just a very specific hypothesis. There's a lot of evidence. A theory is used to explain many observations, not just one, like a hypothesis, many observations, and devise new and testable hypotheses. Then here I'd like to pause because think about let's kind of look at the difference, the relationship between a theory and a hypothesis versus a hypothesis and a prediction. So if you remember what we talked about earlier, from one hypothesis, you can make multiple predictions to test it. And in a sense, that's the same relationship between a theory and a hypothesis. From one theory, you can have many different hypotheses. And that's actually a concept we're going to discuss more in the next slide. And your book says, like any other scientific idea, a theory has to be refined or just completely given up if something comes out and proves it wrong, right? So there's contradictory evidence. As technology gets better, we have better ways of testing things. And very often, we just learn more and learn that things we thought we knew before just turn out to be not true. So are there any questions on this slide before we talk about this bullet point a little bit more on the next slide?
Mm-mm.
All right. So this is just an example, not from your book. So you definitely don't memorize the details of this. This is just an example of how one prediction can result in multiple hypotheses. So here's two hypotheses. One of them says that long, thin roots are an adaptation that helps some plants survive in an urban habitat. So here's a picture I took of a tree starting to grow between concrete and stone, right? So obviously to do that, it's going to need long, thin roots. Now here's a tree back here. You can barely see it, but that's a palm tree. It doesn't necessarily have the same kind of long, thin roots this thing does. So a palm tree probably wouldn't grow right there, right? It was that adaptation that gave that plant that advantage, allowed it to do it. Another example would be the unusual bone structure in a hummingbird's wings, how that is an evolutionary adaptation that provides an advantage in gathering nectar from flowers. So again, that organism, because of the way it's built, has an advantage because of its adaptation. So here we have two hypotheses that seem like they're unrelated. One's about plants, one's about animals. But your book points out that the following theory ties these seemingly unrelated hypotheses together. And that theory is adaptations to the local environment evolved by natural selection. So again, one theory leads to many hypotheses. We only just wrote these two. There's so many hypotheses about natural selection. And again, that's just an example. We won't talk about natural selection until later in the semester. There are some questions on the study guide, but for the exam, exam 1 will not cover natural selection. So any questions about this? Okay, this brings us to the final portion, which are facts. Facts are important, and you need to know what they are. A fact is a piece of information considered objectively true based on all current evidence. So basically, and one thing you can think of about facts is they are the opposite of opinions, right? Because facts are objective, they're not subjective. If I were to tell you Roca's has the best margarita in town, that's not a fact. That's a fact for me, but it's not a fact because it's not objective. That's subjective.
I'm pretty sure it's a fact, though.
Right? Well, I should go verify. Which brings us to the second bullet point. A fact can be verified, and therefore it's distinct from opinion. So, if I were to say fact, Roca's is closer to my house than Mexiconi's. That is a fact. I could verify that. I could get on Google and, measure out how long how far it is. But yeah, this is where it gets more important to me, these last two bullet points. Many people associate facts with science, right? As they should, because science is all about getting facts. Like, we focus on finding facts, collecting facts, if you will, accumulating them. But that's not our primary goal. So, for example, the research that I did, like I said, it was about the watermelon genome. I could say fact, this gene is expressed this much. Fact, that gene was expressed that much. And that is what I did for hundreds of genes. I just said they were expressed this much and that much. And that was a bunch of facts. But by itself, that means nothing. Those facts are nothing. They're nothing until someone, the scientist, takes those facts and explains something with them. And that's why, and this is verbatim from your book, the cornerstones of science are the explanations that apply to the greatest variety of phenomena. So again, the point here is, yes, we need facts, but facts in and of themselves are not the goal because they by themselves are useless. It's only useful when we can take those facts and explain something with them, which brings us to this next slide right here. Your book points out, these three famous scientists, Newton and Darwin and Einstein. And the reason they're so famous, it's not because they came up with a bunch of facts. It's just the fact they are famous because their facts just explained so much. And this one in the middle, Darwin, we'll talk about him later in the semester. And that is it for this lecture. Are there any questions? It doesn't even have to be about this lecture because this is getting recorded. So if you have any questions about the course or anything, now's a good time to ask so I can record it and your fellow classmates can learn from it. No questions? All right. That's good. That gives us, well, if you're going to be here, that gives me about 22 minutes until lab. So I'm going to log out of here and I'll be back at noon to do a pre-lab lecture for this week's lab.